There was a time when moving meant something was going right. A better job in another city, a bigger home across town, a fresh start that came with the quiet promise of upward motion. Americans moved often almost rhythmically. It was part of the system's design mobility as a pathway to opportunity. But something has changed. Today, Americans are moving less than they have in decades, not slightly less, structurally less. Fewer people are crossing state lines. Fewer are even changing neighborhoods. The country hasn't stopped growing, but it has started to settle in place. At first glance, it looks like stability, people staying put, communities becoming rooted. But beneath that stillness, a different pattern is forming. Because when movement slows in a system that once depended on it, something else has to absorb the pressure. And increasingly, that pressure is being felt inside homes, inside budgets, and inside decisions people are no longer able to make. This isn't just about relocation. It's about what happens when mobility, one of the quiet engines of the American economy, begins to stall. And what replaces it when it does. For most of the 20th century, Americans moved frequently. In the 1950s and 60s, roughly 20% of the population changed residence each year. Even into the 1990s, mobility remained high, hovering around 16%. Moving wasn't an exception. It was a normal part of economic life. People followed jobs, opportunities, and affordability across cities and states. But by 2023, that number had fallen to around 8 to 9%. In other words, Americans today are moving at less than half the rate they once did. This decline didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, almost quiet. Year after year, the percentage slipped until it became one of the lowest mobility rates ever recorded in modern U.S. history. At first, analysts pointed to demographics. An aging population tends to move less. That's true. But it doesn't fully explain the shift. Even younger groups, those historically most mobile, are moving less than previous generations did at the same age. So what changed? Part of the answer begins with housing. In 2015, the median home price in the U.S. was around $290,000. By 2024, it had crossed $420,000. At the same time, mortgage rates, which hovered near 3% during the pandemic era, rose sharply above 6 to 7% in recent years. This created a new kind of friction. Millions of homeowners are now locked into low-rate mortgages they secured earlier. Selling their home doesn't just mean moving, it means replacing a 3% loan with a 7% one. Even if their income has increased, the math often doesn't work. So they stay. But ownership isn't the only constraint. Renters who traditionally moved more frequently are also slowing down. Between 2015 and 2024, median rent prices increased by over 30% nationally, with some metro areas seeing much sharper spikes. Moving to a new apartment often means facing current market rates significantly higher than what long-term tenants are paying. So they stay too. What emerges is a system where both owners and renters are increasingly anchored in place, not by preference, but by cost. And then there are the less visible forces. Transaction costs have quietly risen. Moving itself, hiring trucks, deposits, closing fees, has become more expensive. Insurance markets in certain states have tightened, making relocation riskier. Property taxes have adjusted upward in fast-growing regions. Each individual cost may seem manageable, but together they create a barrier. Mobility, once frictionless, now comes with layers of financial consequences. And the data reflects it. Interstate migration has slowed. Job-related relocation has declined. Even within the same city, people are less likely to change residences than they were a decade ago. What used to be a dynamic system, people moving in response to opportunity, is becoming more static. But the most important shift isn't just that people are moving less. It's that they're staying for different reasons. Not because they've reached stability, but because moving has become a financial risk they can't justify. And when a system designed around movement begins to rely on people staying still, it starts to change the nature of opportunity itself. Daniel is 39 years old. He lives in a 3-bedroom home outside of Phoenix, Arizona. He bought it in 2020, just before prices surged. At the time, it felt like a responsible decision. The house cost $315,000. His mortgage rate was 2.9%. Monthly payments came out to around $1,650, including taxes. It wasn't cheap, but it was manageable. Daniel works as a logistics coordinator for a regional distribution company. His income is about $6,400 a month before taxes. His wife Maria works part-time at a dental office, bringing in another $1,800. Together, they felt stable, not wealthy, but moving forward. That was 4 years ago. Today, their income has increased slightly. Combined, they now bring in around $8,600 a month before taxes. On paper, they're doing better. But their monthly expenses tell a different story. Their mortgage is still $1,650. That hasn't changed. But property taxes have risen. What used to be about $250 a month is now closer to $420. Their homeowner's insurance, once $110 monthly, has climbed to nearly $380 adjusted after regional insurers reassessed risk tied to extreme heat and wildfire exposure. Electricity has become unpredictable. Summers in Phoenix have grown hotter longer. Their cooling bill alone can exceed $500 in peak months. Averaged out utilities now sit around $350 monthly. Groceries for a family of four, $950. Health insurance premiums and out-of-pocket costs, $780. Car payments and fuel, $1,100. Childcare for their youngest, $900. And then there are the irregular costs that no longer feel irregular. Last year, their roof required partial repair after a storm, $4,200 out of pocket. Their water heater failed 2 months later, another $1,300. Neither expense was catastrophic, but together they erased any margin they thought they had. When Daniel sits down and looks at the numbers, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. After taxes, their take-home pay is roughly $6,800. Their fixed monthly expenses, without counting emergencies, already exceed $6,500. What remains is not savings, it's exposure. And this is where movement enters the equation. A year ago, Daniel was offered a job in Dallas. Higher salary, about $9,200 a month combined household income if they moved. On paper, it looked like progress. But the math didn't hold. Selling their current home would mean giving up a 2.9% mortgage and entering a market where rates hovered near 7%. Even if they bought a similarly priced home, their monthly payment would jump by over $1,000. Property taxes in Texas are higher. Insurance costs are volatile. Closing costs alone would exceed $20,000. Renting temporarily wasn't much better. Comparable homes in Dallas were leasing for $2,400 to $2,800 a month. The raise wasn't enough to offset the shift, so they stayed. Not because it was the better opportunity, but because it was the less risky option. And that decision carries its own weight. Daniel now turns down promotions that require relocation. Maria delays increasing her hours because childcare costs would rise. They postpone repairs that feel non-urgent. Vacations are reconsidered. Nothing collapses, but nothing moves forward either. From the outside, their life appears stable. They own a home, they have 2 incomes. They are doing what the system expects. But inside their monthly budget, something has quietly changed. Their house is no longer just a place to live. It has become a financial position they cannot easily exit. And the longer they stay, the more that position defines what choices remain possible. Because what looks like stability is increasingly a form of constraint. What's happening to Daniel isn't isolated. It's part of a broader shift in how the American economy distributes opportunity, and more importantly, how it restricts movement within it. For decades, mobility acted as a release valve. If a city became too expensive, people moved. If jobs disappeared in one region, they followed them to another. If housing costs rose, supply in other areas absorbed the pressure. Movement wasn't just personal, it was systemic. But that system depended on one condition: the cost of moving had to be lower than the benefit of moving. That equation is quietly breaking down. Housing is the first layer. When mortgage rates doubled, they didn't just make homes more expensive. They created a divide between those who already own at low rates and those who don't. This is often called the lock-in effect. Homeowners with 2 to 3% mortgages are now sitting on financial contracts that are almost impossible to replicate. Moving means giving that up and accepting significantly higher monthly costs for the same or even smaller space. So even when better jobs exist elsewhere, people don't follow them. But housing is only one piece. The second layer is insurance. In states like Florida, California, and parts of the Southwest, insurers have either raised premiums sharply or exited markets entirely. Risk is being recalculated not just based on past data, but on future climate exposure. This changes how mobility works. Relocating to certain regions now carries a new variable. Can you even insure the home, and at what cost? In some cases, insurance premiums are increasing faster than wages, which means moving isn't just about finding a job or affording a home. It's about entering a risk environment that is harder to predict and harder to exit. The third layer is local taxation and municipal finance. As property values rise, so do property taxes, especially in fast-growing areas. Local governments depend heavily on this revenue. Infrastructure, schools, and services are tied to it. But for homeowners, this creates a dynamic where staying put doesn't mean cost stability. Even without moving, the cost of owning increases year after year, and moving to a cheaper area doesn't always solve the problem. Some regions compensate for lower home prices with higher taxes. Others offset low taxes with insurance costs or infrastructure gaps that translate into higher out-of-pocket expenses. What appears affordable at first glance often reveals hidden costs over time. Then there's the labor market. Historically, mobility allowed workers to match themselves with better opportunities. But as movement slows, so does that matching process. Employers adjust. Instead of competing nationally for talent, they rely more on local labor pools. Wage growth becomes uneven. Workers in high-cost areas may see higher nominal salaries but also higher living costs. And workers in lower-cost areas may find fewer pathways to higher-paying roles without relocating, which they can't easily do. This creates a kind of geographic inertia. Not a frozen economy, but a slower one. Less responsive, less flexible. And then there are the transaction layers, the costs that sit between decisions and action. Closing costs, agent fees, moving services, temporary housing, time off work. Each one is manageable on its own. But together they create friction. And in economic systems, friction matters. Because when enough friction accumulates, behavior changes. People stop optimizing. They stop seeking better opportunities, not because they don't exist, but because accessing them requires too much disruption, too much cost, too much uncertainty. And this is where the system quietly shifts. Mobility was once a mechanism for upward movement. Now, in many cases, it has become a calculated risk, one that fewer households are willing or able to take. The result isn't dramatic. There's no sudden collapse, no visible breaking point. Instead, the system adjusts. People stay longer in jobs that don't grow. They remain in homes that no longer fit. They absorb rising costs instead of escaping them. And over time, this creates a new kind of stability. Not the stability of progress, but the stability of constraint. Because when movement slows across millions of households, the economy doesn't just become less dynamic. It begins to redistribute pressure inward into budgets, into choices, and eventually into people themselves. At first, the change doesn't feel structural. It feels personal. A delayed decision. A postponed move. A job not taken. A renovation pushed to next year. None of these moments carry urgency on their own. They blend into everyday life's small adjustments that seem temporary. But over time, they begin to accumulate. Because when movement becomes difficult, decisions don't disappear. They compress. And compressed decisions have a different weight. Daniel starts noticing it in small ways. He spends more time calculating, rechecking bills, running scenarios in his head. What if the AC breaks? What if insurance rises again? What if one income drops even briefly? It's not panic. It's persistence. A low-level awareness that the margin is thinner than it used to be. And that awareness has a cost. Chronic financial pressure doesn't always show up as crisis. More often, it shows up as cognitive load. The constant background processing of risk. The mental energy spent maintaining stability rather than pursuing change. Over time, this shifts behavior. Decisions become more conservative. Opportunities are evaluated not by their upside, but by their potential downside. A higher-paying job in another city is no longer a step forward. It's a complex equation with too many unknowns. So the safer option wins. And the safer option is usually staying. But staying comes with its own psychological structure. There is a subtle shift that happens when a home once associated with security becomes tied to financial exposure. Every unexpected repair is not just an inconvenience, it's a reminder. Every insurance notice, every tax reassessment, every utility spike reinforces the same underlying message. This stability is conditional. And when stability feels conditional, the nervous system responds accordingly. Not with visible stress, but with sustained vigilance. Over time, that vigilance turns into fatigue. Decision fatigue. The kind that doesn't come from making too many choices, but from knowing that every choice carries more consequence than it used to. And this is where the system escalates in a way that isn't immediately visible in data. Mobility doesn't just decline physically, it declines psychologically. People begin to think differently about change itself, not as opportunity, but as disruption. Not as progress, but as risk. And when enough individuals begin to internalize that shift, something deeper happens. The economy doesn't just slow in movement, it slows in imagination. Because the idea that you can move geographically, financially, socially is part of what sustains long-term growth. When that idea weakens even slightly, it changes how people plan their lives. What they delay, what they avoid, what they no longer expect. And none of this shows up immediately in GDP or employment reports. It shows up quietly, in smaller decisions, in narrower options, in lives that begin to orbit around maintaining what they already have, rather than reaching for something new. Which leads to a deeper question. If a system continues to function, but fewer people feel able to move within it, what kind of system does it eventually become? For generations, mobility was never just about changing locations. It was a quiet promise embedded in the system that if something didn't work, you could move. That if costs rose too high, there was somewhere else to go. That progress wasn't fixed, it was reachable. That promise didn't disappear. It shifted. Today, the system still functions. Homes are bought, jobs are filled, cities grow. On the surface, nothing appears broken. But underneath, the pathways between those pieces have narrowed. Movement has become heavier. Decisions have become slower. Opportunities feel more distant, not because they don't exist, but because accessing them carries more risk than before. And when enough people begin to stay not by choice, but by calculation, the meaning of stability begins to change. It no longer represents arrival. It represents position. A position that must be maintained, protected, managed. And over time, that changes something subtle but fundamental. Because a system built on the idea of movement doesn't need to stop completely to feel different. It only needs to slow. Just enough that people begin to adjust their expectations without realizing it. And the question is no longer whether Americans can move, but whether they still believe it's worth trying,